Okay, thanks for sticking with us. The goal of our paper, which is highlighted in this presentation, is to examine the use of existing rangeland monitoring data collected by public agencies for characterizing and modeling wildlife habitat in rangelands. We try to take a fresh look at environmental data traditionally collected during rangeland monitoring and consider how it can be used effectively for wildlife management, particularly by the next generation of rangeland resource managers. I want to thank my co-authors and highlight that our upcoming rangeland paper takes a much deeper dive into these topics. So Reed Noss, in a conservation biology essay back in 1990, pointed out that in any monitoring program, particular attention should be paid to specifying the questions that monitoring is intended to answer. And I highlight, validating the relationships between indicators and the components of biodiversity is also very important. And we can think about that in the context of this figure that was produced by Gordon Taves and used multiple times when we think about rangeland monitoring. This idea that there's key attributes of ecosystem function, things like biotic integrity, soil and site stability, and hydrologic function. And all of these are used for assessing and monitoring natural systems. And in this figure, the boxes are those major structural components of ecosystems, and then the arrows are the functional relationships. But practically, when we talk about something like AIM, the Assessment Inventory Monitoring Program of BLM, we think about these specific indicators, things we're measuring on the ground, and trying to get an indication of bare ground, vegetation composition, and so forth. The question that we have is, how well is this connecting back to wildlife habitat? And you could think about it as a one-to-one, but really all of these key attributes are part of wildlife habitat, whether we're talking about the grasses, forbs, and shrubs and trees as vegetation, which most people think of wildlife habitat in terms of vegetation. But look at soil resources, minerals and nutrients, things like the quality of that's being produced in plants for nutrition of animals, water, organic matter, and biota, the soil-water interface, plant litter, soil structure, and biological crusts. And then in the watershed layer, the hydrologic function and riparian vegetation, all key aspects of wildlife habitat. So we really need to be thinking holistically about wildlife habitat and how well these core indicators and potentially supplemental indicators are getting at those attributes. Are they answering questions about forage quality and quantity, nesting, birthing, and rearing locations, thermal shelter, basking areas, view sheds and concealment, movement paths, connectivity, burrows and microsites, and then just special habitat features that may be specific to an individual species? We have to also be thinking about this at multiple spatial scales. We often work at the plot level, but as you've seen in the series of presentations today, we're crossing multiple spatial scales when we're dealing with monitoring these days. In the inner circle there are the attributes we measure in vegetation and soil monitoring. At the plot level, it's typically things like soil type and depth, bare ground, plant species cover, vegetation height, plant species richness, and canopy gaps. At the mid-level, it might be things like bare ground, vegetation height with something like LIDAR, functional group cover, and canopy gaps. And then finally, at the landscape or regional level, we're measuring things like classification of vegetation or estimating vegetation height, getting landscape component cover or fractional component of various attributes that we can see in the remote sensing imagery. But those are just things that are being measured. We're still not understanding quite how well that relates to wildlife habitat. Are we getting information about landscape cover, connectivity, habitat patches, refugia, concealment, thermal cover, and so forth? And we were curious about this question and wanted to know, how often are we accomplishing this? And what we found when we did a scouring of the literature is that most standardized rangeland monitoring and even non-standardized site-based monitoring data was being used for validation of remote sensing products, but not really being used in the context of wildlife habitat. And that was interesting. We didn't expect that. We thought there'd be a lot more examples. The other question that we had is, are we measuring the right things? What do we really need to be measuring? And do we need to be doing this on a species by species level in terms of asking that question? Or could we be doing it in terms of species assemblages or communities? And then what additional supplemental methods might be needed? You might have seen in Rangeland this paper by David Toledo looking at the roadbell cover pole and how well that relates to standardized monitoring methods. but something like, a roll bell poll could give us more information about potentially what's important for wildlife, even though it's still getting at the same aspects of height and cover and so forth of vegetation. So we needed to know, how can existing programs be modified or adapted to achieve better communication of needs and linkages between vegetation monitoring and wildlife habitat assessments? And so we put these together as a set of important lessons for future of adaptive monitoring. And I'll just walk through these individually. So number one, build bridges between land management agencies and wildlife focused entities. And what we mean by that is most of the habitat is being monitored or measured by federal agencies typically, but the animal data, the data on the actual individual species or populations is being measured by the state fish and game agencies. So there's a very little connection between those two. Facilitate coordination among agencies and organizations to increase utility of monitoring data for wildlife. Things like data sharing agreements and curation, very little effort's being put into those. And then where's the money to support all of that? Improve linkages with remote sensing products, particularly at the mid-level and multi-scale needs. In this image that we show on the right, the mid-level, shows an example of a drone or maybe a ground-based LiDAR, but a lot of that's being done at a very experimental level. We haven't thought critically about how to incorporate that into standardized monitoring. Align rangeland soil data with wildlife habitat needs. Like I mentioned, we often just think about vegetation when we think about wildlife habitat, but vegetation is being influenced by the soils, and burrows also are critically important for wildlife, particularly in rangelands. Number 5, integrate existing rangeland resource tools into decision support tools for wildlife. There's new and sophisticated tools being developed all the time, things like the rangeland, it's RAP, I can't remember the acronym. And then also things like data sources like the Land Treatment Digital Library that could be used in decision support tools for wildlife. Number 6, connect rangeland monitoring with wildlife threat and risk assessments. There's some good examples for the greater sage grouse. Beyond that, there's not very many good examples out there. Number 7, improve connections with ecological site descriptions and wildlife habitat. And I know there's been efforts even with the Society for Range Management to get this underway, but we're just scratching the surface on this topic that could be very important. And then finally, number 8, support big data. And what we mean by this is thinking about these soil and vegetation data repositories or remote sensing data repositories. How well are they being supported and in the long run? And how well are they being even linked to the wildlife population data that may be managed by the state or other entities? What are we doing about data accessibility and data management and stewardship, data sharing, and then long-term commitments to support these things? These are really important topics that I think we need to be focused on as we move forward. I just want to close with a fairly recent call to action for better monitoring. This is a paper, it was written in response to the 2012 wildfire season where about 2.7 million acres burned in sage grouse habitat and about 1.8 million acres of that was in priority sage grouse habitat. But the author stated in regards to the need for better information on post-fire ESR treatments, as prevention and rehabilitation techniques are being tried and tested, monitoring will become increasingly essential for measuring outcomes and informing adaptive management. They really shared a vision where, and this is a good way to summarize this whole session, monitoring data are collected using a standardized approach that will inform all resource programs and be integrated into a landscape level network so that information can be extrapolated beyond the project to inform regional and national conditions and trends. And I emphasized in this quote the all resource programs because of the glaring need for better integration between vegetation monitoring and an understanding of wildlife habitat trajectories. Only with these linkages will we improve our understanding and prediction of factors driving wildlife populations and improving management capacity for wildlife and biodiversity. Thank you for listening.